Good morning, West Portal. And happy Thanksgiving. Well, thank you. I found myself thinking, I wonder if Thanksgiving doesn't flow best from a heart that is aware of God's faithfulness in our lives. And the story that we get to continue, if you will, this morning, has God's faithfulness really front and center in it. If you weren't with us last week, you may have missed this, but we began last week our journey through the book of Exodus here as a faith family at West Portal this year. Exodus is one of these wonderful stories. It's a story of oppression. It's a story of rescue. It is a story also of the forming of a family, of the forming and the shaping of a community where God will reign as king. And in this way, it is not so much a new story, as we were saying last Sunday, but it's a continuation of God's story that goes all the way back to the beginning of creation. Humanity messes up God's creation story with sin pretty quickly. But while the full details of God's long-range plan are not divulged in that section, what we do know is that God's blessing is going to continue with humanity and with his people. And God's blessing in some way is going to come through the person and the family of Abraham. Somehow through this one individual, God's blessing is going to spill over in a way that impacts all humanity. And Abraham, of course, eventually has a son, Isaac, who has a son, Jacob. Jacob, if you recollect, his name is changed to Israel. That's where we kind of get the story of the Israelites from. Jacob, at some point, relocates his family to Egypt. This is both to escape a severe famine that's happening in Canaan and also to be reunited with his son Joseph. And several generations go by with this family in Egypt, and the photo albums get really big. They multiply greatly, and God is blessing this people group, but a Pharaoh comes to power, and this particular Pharaoh does not see this growing immigrant people group as a blessing. But rather as a threat. And so he begins to take several steps to put a stop to this population growth. And it begins kind of with slavery and oppression, and later it will move to more murderous methods, if you will. One of the questions that drives the storyline of Exodus is, who will Israel serve? If you remember, serve and work and worship, we did a bit of a Hebrew word study on the word avodah last week, but all of these are layered concepts and can be translated a number of ways. Who will Israel serve? And the answer, at least in the opening chapter and a half, seems pretty obvious. This people group serves Pharaoh. But where and when God is in control, we said power is sometimes found in very unexpected places. And it's a series of women in a very patriarchal culture who play a prominent role in the opening portion of this story in undermining and outwitting and outmaneuvering Pharaoh and some of his plans. And it's into this kind of season of darkness and discouragement and despair that we read of a baby being born, a Hebrew baby, and whose mother, in desperation, places him in a basket and puts it along the banks of the river. How strategically, we are left to wonder a little bit. But nonetheless, the basket is found by an Egyptian princess, and her heart is moved compassionately so that she will adopt this child into her household. And that's kind of where our story dropped us off last week. If you have your Bibles, Exodus 2, verse 11 is where we're going to pick our story up. Couple of quick call them disclaimers here at the outset. Last week, and I want to reiterate this, we're encouraging you to be reading through Exodus with us. And in fact, if you would read ahead in the story, that'll be helpful. We will come to some Sundays where we won't have time to look at the entirety of the text. We'll just pick and choose. And if you kind of read ahead, it'll put you in a good place to kind of understand the conversation that we're going to have. I pointed you in the direction of a handful of resources last week. Both the Bible Project is a wonderful video overview of the book. In fact, it's a two-part series. There's some wonderful kind of documentaries on Right Now Media. Our family spent yesterday afternoon at the Rostern Youth Farm. There's a fantastic corn maze there, but I'm not sure if you're aware of this. There is also a life-size replica of the tabernacle there. It's the only one in all of Canada right now. There's a lady that is kind of instrumental in overseeing this. If you catch her, she has done, I think, up to 1 hour tours. I don't think they're still doing that. Considering the size, a 1 hour tour would be very long for this particular facility, but it'll give you a sense of somebody whose lifelong passion has been the study of the tabernacle, and our family had a chance to kind of walk through that. And if you recollect, the building details of the tabernacle in all of its excruciating, painful detail is included at the end of the book of Exodus. And this is not the most fun reading for most of us, but having walked through and to have an idea of kind of the size of the courtyard, and we were inside even like the first part, and our kids are like, so what's this basin for, and what's this table for? And I just think we're going to read this with a bit of a renewed interest suddenly, having had something to kind of see and compare with. So if you're curious, this is a shameless plug for this, but I believe the facility is still going to be open through till the end of October. So if you're curious to check that out, admission to that is just general admission, gets you a free walk around in with the tabernacle. So you can check that out at your leisure. Also, if you're reading ahead, Exodus, as many great biblical stories, and in particular Old Testament stories are, it may raise questions for you. If you have questions or comments as you read with us or as you read ahead, feel free to send them to us, and we'll see if we can make this experience a little bit more interactive. I can't promise it will shape all of our teaching, but it may, and at the very least, it may well also shape some of the discussion time that we choose, or the way we lead that after our service. So just as a way of giving you a taste of this, one of the questions that was raised last week during our discussion time, so after the service, was, how can you say, Andrew, that we don't know definitively what century the Exodus took place in light of 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1? Now, if you have this on the slide, 1 Kings 6, verse 1 says that the Exodus took place 480 years before Solomon's fourth year on the throne. And we can pinpoint Solomon's fourth year pretty definitively. It would be right around 966 BC, and you can kind of just back up 480 years from there, and it would give us a date of right in the middle of the 15th century for the Exodus. This is the traditional date for the Exodus. And I don't have any qualms with this. It may well be exactly right here in the middle of the 15th century. The reason the conversation on this subject continues to swirl is for a number of reasons. I'll just share a few with you, and this is why I choose to say we don't know definitively. So to begin with, we have examples from ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian record keeping where they use numbers in less than a precise way. They use them generally. So for example, 480 years in an ancient record-keeping format could also just be a way of saying, here's 12 generations of 40 years. Now if this is the case, then those generations would overlap in a way that it's not a precise 480 years. And in our 21st century mindset, that drives us nuts. We go, nobody would ever use numbers this way, but in the ancient world, this is not uncommon. And so at least that's a possibility, and here are a few reasons on top of that why this plays in. So in Exodus 1, the Israelites are building the store cities, you remember this, of Pithom and Ramses. Names that don't match with the middle of the 15th century, but would match very well about 200 years later. Now, that might just be an editorial update, but that's one of those things that kind of makes people go, oh, this isn't lining up quite like I thought. We have archaeological evidence of the destruction of a whole bunch of Canaanite cities in and around the 13th century. So again, about 200 years later, and it has people wondering, is this some of the archaeological evidence of Joshua and the Israelites conquering the Promised Land? And again, we don't know that, but if so, again, the dating feels like it would fit better with a later date rather than the traditional one. The other point that's interesting, or at least I found it interesting, is this. As our story progresses, especially as we get into kind of the signs and wonders, the plagues, if you will, of Egypt, what we find is that Moses is repeatedly being able to go to Pharaoh, and they're always having this kind of back and forth conversation. And Moses is situated in and around the Nile Delta territory. In the middle of the 15th century, which is the traditional date for this, Pharaoh's palace and primary residence is in Thebes, which is about 400 miles to the south. And again, it's one of those things that doesn't sync up well with Moses' seeming access to him. So these are some of the reasons why I choose to say, we don't know definitively. But from an ancient standpoint, we know somewhere roughly within about 200 years, and that's very close. And that gives you a little bit of a taste of what we're prepared to do if you ask us really good questions. All right? Don't send us too many. I only have so much time. Exodus chapter 2, verse 11 is where we're going. Let's jump into our story. We have a lot of ground to cover. One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The next day he went out and saw two Hebrews fighting. And he asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? You thinking of killing me like you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." Now, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well. Now, a priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came to draw water and fill the troughs to water their father's flock. Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock to boot. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" Kind of hints that this was not an uncommon situation for them to run into. They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." "Where is he?" he asked his daughters. "Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. And Zipporah gave birth to a son, and Moses named him Gershom, saying, "I have become an alien," or a stranger, if you will, in a foreign land. It's interesting because a lot happens between verse 10 and verse 11 in this chapter. If you remember, verse 11, Moses is taken as an infant or a very young boy to the palace and adopted. And in verse 11, he is all grown up. And it's impressive, actually. Some of the way this story is echoed in our New Testament hints that Moses is perhaps as old as 40. At this point in time. We can be sure that he will have been afforded all of the privileges and education that will have come with being raised as part of Pharaoh's court. It's his passion for justice, though, that's kind of front and center in our story. As in 3 back-to-back incidents, Moses basically reacts and he comes to the defense of some form of injustice. I kind of feel like Moses does his best superhero imitation here. He just needs a costume to kind of work with it. And I don't know what your favorite defender of injustice is, but whether he needs Zorro's mask or Iron Man's suit or Superman's cape or whatever it might happen to be, it feels like Moses has a bit of a crusading kind of a complex that comes to the fore here. This portion of the story does raise several great questions for us. And the one is this: how does Moses identify? Now, when we use that in our culture, it tends to be used around gender norms now, but I mean ethnically. Moses, as a young boy, has been raised his entire life as an Egyptian. How does he identify? And the hints from the text strongly imply he identifies somehow as a Hebrew, but that again leads us to other questions that we simply don't have answers to. So how aware was Moses of his heritage? How did he learn? How much does Pharaoh know? And we're left with all of these wonderful questions that I wish I could answer. They're just not primarily of interest to our narrator. Moses, it seems, though, identifies strongly, despite having been raised with Egyptian royalty, as a Hebrew. And it's this identification coupled with his almost reckless passion for justice that's about to bring our story to a head. And you can see the first confrontation is pretty obvious. Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. By the way, the Hebrew verb for the behavior that the Egyptian is doing to the Hebrew is the exact same verb used for Moses' response to him. So at the very least, we would imply that the beating was severe and potentially life-threatening, death-dealing. And Moses comes to the aid of one that he kind of considers a brother, and it's violent and it's definitive. And our narrator gives no commentary on whether this is something that's good or not. Is the passion good and the action misplaced? Either way, this guy's not going to be bothering this Hebrew again. The very next day, Moses finds himself breaking up a fight with 2 of what he would consider, I guess, his fellow countrymen. Break it up, guys. Honestly, the problem is out there, not in-house. Stop your bickering. It's hard not to read this with a little bit of a sense of idealism on Moses' part. Listen, I'm here to help. I'm here to save. Look at what I can do. And I expect that he is anticipating a much warmer reception than he receives. And the retort basically is, who do you think you are? And that has to have stung. Moses' heart seems to identify with his people, but the Hebrews do not identify back with Moses, the boy of Egyptian privilege. And worse yet, it comes to the surface that the incident, if we can call it that, of the previous day has is not as secretive as Moses was hoping. And if the Hebrews know about this, Moses understands the clock is ticking. It's just a matter of time before Pharaoh finds out, and Moses kind of hightails it out of the territory. Again, this leads us to these wonderful questions that we just don't have answers to. One would presume that an Egyptian prince could kill whoever he wanted in the country and not have any threat to his life as a result. Right? So again, we'd be reading between the lines, but it kind of makes a person wonder, if Moses is aware of his ethnicity, likely Pharaoh has been too. Why hasn't Pharaoh acted against this or on this up till now? And we'd be left to go, that princess in chapter 1 seems surprisingly stubborn and strong-willed. And she may have just said, don't touch my boy. And she was stubborn enough about it that Pharaoh was hands off until Moses gives him a reason to suddenly be justified in doing this. Again, we'd be reading between the lines. Don't misunderstand me on that. But I just find that interesting to speculate about. Either way, Moses flees to Midian. Dumb question, Paul. I didn't check with you ahead of time. Is there a map? No. Okay. Midian is kind of a tough territory to pin down. You'll have to do your best, mental image here. But it's assumed to be kind of in northwest Saudi Arabia. If you can kind of picture the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aqaba, which forks a little bit north of that. Midian is just east of that. It kind of runs up along the borders of Palestine, where territory Israel will later call home. And some have speculated that it also extends west kind of into the wilderness and desert of that region. For our purposes today, what I want to say is this. The Midianites, we don't hear a lot about yet at this point in the story. It's a caravan of Midianite traders that's responsible for actually transporting Joseph to Egypt in the first place, if you want a little point of interest. By the time of the Judges, the Midianites will be enemies of Israel. But what you might not know is that the Midianites trace their ancestry back to Abraham, just like the Israelites do. Abraham has another wife whose name is Keturah, and Keturah has a son named Midian. And so while Moses is a long way from home, we might say he's hanging out with kind of his distant cousins, if that makes sense. They're not unrelated in this way. It also makes us wonder when we hear that Moses' eventual father-in-law here is a priest. We have this interesting thing to go, how much of the Hebrew God might the Midianites be aware of, being able to trace the same ancestry back to Abraham? Again, I'm giving you more questions than we have answers for, but this is the joy of these kinds of stories. Moses is a long way from home, and as was common in the ancient Near East, wells were kind of the common meeting place. For strangers, for travelers, for shepherds, for townsfolk, a new person would naturally gravitate to this kind of a location. And despite how far from home he is, Moses' sense of justice is in no way diminished, as he wastes no time coming to the aid of several Midianite girls who are they're being harassed by some of the local shepherds. If Moses has been raised in Pharaoh's palace, it is almost certain that part of his educational upbringing has included military combat and tactics training. This would actually be very normal, and you do not see Moses pictured this way in most movies. But I expect if he had a staff, he could do some cool stuff with it. I expect that Moses was not only very capable of taking care of himself, but he could do a little butt kicking if and when the time demanded. So I don't know if he drove off these shepherds with harsh language or whether he had to get, a little physically active. I wish there was a video of this. I think it would go viral on YouTube, you can be sure. So Moses not only comes to the defense of these girls, he waters their flock, right? It's just hello, ladies. And not surprisingly, their dad wants to meet this guy. Who's this stranger that was so gracious to you? And ancient hospitality in the Near East is a little head-scratching to me. Can I offer you something to eat? Would you like to marry my daughter? I can't help but notice you're single. And so Moses accepts. What's he supposed to say, right? All appearances in the story at this point suggest that Moses is, I don't know if content is the right word, but prepared to settle down and embrace what it means to live a life kind of away from his people and away from home. And the name of his son Gershom is going to be a constant reminder of this sense of I have become an alien or a stranger or a sojourner in a foreign land. This is, by the way, the same word that's later used to describe Israel's experience in Egypt, that they are strangers in a foreign land. And again, our narrator never comes out and says this, but I find myself wondering, Moses' passion for justice is oriented in the right place. And I think he identifies as a Hebrew, but what he does not identify yet with is the experience that the Hebrews are having. It's almost as if his passion needs to be tempered with some humility. And God is about to say, no, it's okay, I'm going to leave you in the desert here for a while. And you're going to get a taste of, in a small way, what your brothers and sisters are going through. And when I think you're ready for your passion and the experience to kind of mesh up together, I'm going to come connect with you a little bit. Yeah, let's just keep our story going here. Too much time. During that long period, the king of Egypt died, and the Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out. And their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. This is the meanwhile back at the ranch, little intersection here. Here's what's happening back in Egypt. It's not uncommon for us to read the story of Exodus and actually assume it's the same Pharaoh throughout the whole story for two reasons. One is he's never named. He's just Pharaoh. So there's no noticeable change in the way he's referred to. And the second reason is, I want to say the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. If this is the son of the previous Pharaoh, the character of his dad really doesn't change. There's no character evolution here. He's just as obstinate and stubborn and strong-willed as his dad. And so there's no apparent change. I found this interesting. Apparently, it was an established practice in Egypt for a new king to celebrate his ascension to the throne by granting amnesty to those guilty of crimes, that would impact Moses, by releasing prisoners and by freeing slaves. This was a fairly common, you come to power, you throw a party, and the party benefits everybody. Now, if this would be the case, the transition in Egyptian leadership gives the Israelites at least a glimmer of hope that perhaps their situation is going to take a turn for the better. And of course, sadly, this is not to be the case. God's timing is always going to be a source of struggle for you and for me. Why does Israel need to spend several centuries in Egypt before God finally says, oh, now the circumstances and events are such that I'm ready to act? Why does Moses need 40 years in the wilderness? Maybe humility can't be learned in less time. Why do we find 400 years basically between the promised Messiah and the arrival of Jesus? You kind of always feel like, come on, God, like you are a little sluggish. Get with the program. And we've got 2,000 years in counting between Jesus' promise to return and something we're still anticipating. Like when the clock ticks, this is something you and I will always struggle with when it comes to God's plans and God's ways. And I don't have any easy answers on this subject. What I simply want to point out, and I think this is evident in our story, is that God, who is now just being mentioned really for the first time, has not been inactive. His hand has already been seen at work in some of the unexpected places and unexpected characters of the preceding chapters. Why this is now God is ready to work, we're left to speculate. But God has not been absent. When it says God remembered, it's not that he just woke up from a nap and went, wow, it just wasn't on my radar at all. I really need to do something about this. This has been on his radar. He's just finally ready to take some steps towards addressing it. Now, Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, like why the bush doesn't burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush. Here's where you can do like your best voiceover, right? Moses. I don't know what the right one is. Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And at this Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. In the previous chapter, his father-in-law is named Reuel, and now he's referred to as Jethro. And for us, this is weird. There's not a quick answer to this aside from it's not unusual in the ancient world for people to have two names, right? Jacob is also named Israel. I've used those interchangeably in our New Testament. We find Saul also has a Greek name, Paul. We often They rhyme, which makes it even harder, but you tend to use those interchangeably. In fact, Horeb, the mountain of God that's mentioned here, is usually assumed, if it's not speaking of a region, to be kind of synonymous with Mount Sinai that we encounter later. So again, don't get too bent out of shape about that. In the ancient world, a lot of places and people had two names. Either way, Moses is engaged in a very common practice. He's shepherding. He's on the far side of the desert somewhere when he encounters something that you just don't see every day, a burning bush. Well, that was common. The fact it's not burning the bush up is what's weird, and Moses' curiosity is piqued, and so he heads over to take a closer look. And this is where we encounter the angel of the Lord, this puzzling, mysterious figure that makes a few appearances throughout our Old Testament. Angel in this case is a word that just means literally messenger, so a messenger from the Lord. What's fascinating is that every time this particular character shows up, we somehow understand that this messenger is somehow distinct from God, and yet winds up speaking in first person as God, and at the end, people inevitably walk away from the encounter and go, I was in the presence of God. And it's this weird mixture of God and yet somehow distinct that at the very least has led at least some people to wonder, is this an Old Testament manifestation of Jesus? Who is God's messenger? John's biography says Jesus is God's word made visible. That's the way he chooses to describe him. And I don't have a definitive answer to that, but I did find that very interesting. Yeah, God introduces himself. I am the God of, I'm so silly. I've never read this in this way before. I always read, I'm the God of your fathers with an S, and then he goes on to talk about his ancestors. But God doesn't start that way. It's singular. He says, I'm the God of your dad. How much does Moses know about his dad? Right? I have no idea. How much does Moses know even of the God of the Hebrews? You can be sure that his upbringing in the Egyptian palace has not educated him in this regard. So it's a fascinating introduction. I'm the God of your dad. I'm the God of your people that you've heard about, and maybe very vaguely. This is a fascinating way to kind of get into the conversation. And introductions out of the way, God gets down to the purpose for why he's connecting here with Moses. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I'm sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. The Lord has seen, the Lord has heard, and the Lord knows what his people are going through. And to come down is biblical language for when God is about to intervene in a tangible way in human history. God is about to make Israel's oppression his personal business. And that's not good news if you're an Egyptian. Now, God comes in and announces, I'll talk a bit more about this in application, but God comes down and basically announces, I've come to rescue my people. And you can picture Moses kind of going, I'm so excited to hear this. That verse 9 and 10 really have caught him off guard when God then turns around and says, now go, I'm sending you to Pharaoh. And you can picture Moses frantically searching his data bank for some kind of an appropriate response to this kind of a question, an offer, a commissioning. The pauper turned prince turned shepherd, right? The Hebrew turned Egyptian turned Midianite is being invited to play a leading role in God's rescue operation. And Moses, no doubt, floundered for what kind of a response he should have. And so Moses replied. Then Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Given the almost reckless passion that we see Moses acting out on in the previous part of this story, his response is almost a little surprising. We kind of expect that he would actually go, I've been waiting for this all my life. What took you so long? But 40 years in the wilderness apparently has eroded some of that self-confidence into a sense of self-doubt. And Moses' initial response, "Here I am," becomes, who am I? And Moses is about to offer a number of objections to God. I think it's 5 total. We'll just look at the first 2 this morning. I will say this. Moses' opening 2 questions here are really understandable. These flow very logically, and God feels like he interacts very genuinely and graciously as a result. Moses understands, he has seen the oppression of the Israelites. Moses knows firsthand the power and the might of Egypt, and it's not like God is asking him to go smuggle a family of 6 out of Egypt. So this is a monumental undertaking, and Moses crunches the math in his mind, and his first response basically is, "I can't do this. This task is beyond me," which is both entirely correct and entirely beside the point, which is kind of God's answer. "Oh, I know you can't. That's why I'm going with you. Don't worry about it." So Moses is forced to move on to his second objection. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What's his name?' Then what should I tell them?" And God said to Moses, "I am who I am." We'll talk about that in a minute, but is that not like, that sounds like a parent answer. When your kids come to you with something and you give them the answer that's not really an answer, "Because I said so." Go away, I just dealt with it. "I am who I am. Thanks for coming out. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name, forever the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation." And we won't read to the end of chapter 3 today. You can do that on your own. So Moses' opening response of, "Here I am," becomes, "Who am I?" And "Who am I?" becomes, "Who are you?" Yeah, you know what? This is a logical question if you think about it this way. What do the Israelites back in Egypt know about Moses, if they know anything at all at this point? Hebrew boy, raised with privilege, committed murder, and is kind of on the run. And the last time Moses tried to step into this kind of a courageous, "Hey, I'm here to help you guys" role, he got snubbed. They're like, "You may identify with us, but we don't identify with you. Who do you think you are?" So Moses is, like, his question here to God is not irrational. It's kind of like, if you want me to go, I already know what their response is going to be, so can you give me some credentials that I can flash at the door? Actually, that'll help verify. No, I come with a little bit of authority. God vouches for me in some way. Here's what I can tell you. And so Moses asks God for his name, and God, of course, gives that wonderfully cryptic answer. "I am who I am. Ayah, Asher, Ayah." You want a grammar lesson for this? This is the first person singular verb "to be," simply repeated twice. Which means there's a variety of ways we can translate this, by the way. Where it's a little bit unclear. It can be "I am who I am." It could be "I will be who I will be." "I will cause to be what I will cause to be." Or it could also be "I will be who I am." I was reading at least one author this past week that said that may actually be the best essence of what it seems God is saying, because the implication is that God says, "You can trust me. I will be who I have always been. I will be God for you. I will continue to be and operate as the God of my people. Trust me on this." And then God adds, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. This is my name that you should kind of remember forever.'" So a little bit of an additional Hebrew grammar lesson. If you have your Bibles open, by the way, because I don't know if this was on the screen behind me, but where it says "the Lord," you should notice that "Lord" is all in capital letters. This is done on purpose. This is, in Hebrew, it's 4 consonants that are rendered kind of into English as YHWH. If you walk in scholarly circles, they sometimes call this the tetragrammaton. And I know I'm losing you here for a minute, but that's just a complicated way of tetra is 4, grammaton is letters. So these are the 4 letters that we tend to refer to, or that we capture as God's personal name. And so throughout your Old Testament, you will find, when you find Lord capitalized like that, that's the author's way of using the personal name of God in this context. Now, Hebrew is a funny language. You never write the vowels in Hebrew, which seems like a great idea to me. That'd be so, think of all the space you would save with that. The downside is you need to know the vowels in order to pronounce the word. And if you go a long time without saying a word, sometimes the pronunciation is lost to the sands of time. And that's a little bit what we have with this particular name. So in the past, it has been rendered Jehovah. Yehovah. This is kind of where that pronunciation has come from. I believe that's very popular if you are a strong proponent of the King James Bible. Jehovah's Witnesses have drawn their name from this as well. We're here on behalf of, and then they use God's personal name. Today, it's almost universally accepted that this is quite likely wrong, and that Yahweh is almost certainly the best way that we can and should pronounce that. What you should know is that Yahweh is the third person masculine singular of Ayah. You staying with me here? No. God says to Moses, let me make this very simple. God comes to Moses who says, what's your name? He says, I am. Oh, but by the way, it'll be weird if you call me that because it'll make it sound like you're saying I'm God. Right? If the Israelites say to you, who sent you? And Moses says, I am. I said, no, that's going to be, grammar matters here. So you can refer to me, Yahweh translated very literally is essentially he is. Which is beautiful. By the way, if I can take a little bit of a rabbit trail here this morning into our New Testament, I want to just draw reference to a story that has echoes all the way back here into Exodus chapter 3, which is beautiful. Sometimes you will bump into people, or you'll be reading an article online or something, and it's popular for people to say, Jesus, for all the great things that he taught, and perhaps miracles he did, and all the wonderful things and influence that he left, he never actually had a God complex. Jesus never said he was God. That's just something that's kind of been inserted along the line by others who wanted to believe this about him. So in John's biography of Jesus in chapter 8, you can flip there if you want, it won't matter. Jesus is embroiled in this wonderful, borderline heated conversation with some of the Jewish leaders. It's all in and around the subject of the Israelite ancestor Abraham. That's kind of the anchor point of this conversation, right? And Jesus is saying, if you're really children of Abraham, you would live differently and you would accept, kind of my testimony about myself. And they're calling him illegitimate because nobody knows who Jesus' dad was. It's part of the beautiful nature of this particular heated argument. And Jesus finally drops the following hand grenade kind of into the conversation. And he says the following. He goes, I tell you the truth. Before Abraham ever was, I am. And it's fascinating because at that point, the Jews look around for any kind of rock they can pick up and they try to put Jesus to death. Why? Because the grammar police are really obstinate in first century Palestine. No, because grammar matters and everybody understood exactly what Jesus was saying. Before Abraham was, he didn't say God was. He said it in the first person singular. You don't do that. And it's a fascinating story where you catch the echoes of God's long-term redemptive and rescue plan that Exodus gives us a mirror of, if you will, in many ways, and the echoes of that ripple all the way back here and into Exodus chapter 3. Like I said, you can read through the rest of chapter 3 on your own. Let's move to a little bit of application. And as we said last Sunday, story, especially Old Testament story, doesn't lend itself as neat and tidily to specific application points. When Paul teaches about humility or about generosity or about holiness and purity in life, we go, well, you can make bridges really easily to kind of, here's how I might live differently. Story is always a little bit different, but it's not inapplicable to life. We just have to work harder to do it because story gives us always an enhanced picture of who God is and of who we are, and it does invite us to live differently as a result, but you have to build those bridges a little bit more tangibly yourself. Here's the big idea for the morning, friends. The big idea is this: God works in the world through us. I was talking a little bit about the mixed messages that chapter 3, verse 8, I want to say 8 and 10 make. You have to feel for Moses, right? God shows up to him in the wilderness and basically says, I've seen the suffering of my people, and I've come to rescue them. And you can picture Moses going, you go, God. And then God says, now go, I'm sending you. Moses, wait a minute. You just said you had this. Am I doing this? Am you doing this? Make up your mind. No, God's not confused. This is just the way God loves to work in the world. God works through people. And this is not a new revelation, although we sometimes lose sight of this. This tracks all the way back into the early chapters of Genesis. We were bridge building in that regard last Sunday, right? God creates this beautiful, good world where his presence can dwell, like can live literally alongside his image-bearing creation, you and me. And the question we would say is, so who's ruling the world? Well, God is in an ultimate sense, but very specifically in those opening chapters of Genesis, God takes the keys to that car and he says, by the way, look after that for me. Rule over is the task that's handed to people. It says, you will be my representatives in this world. You will be the ones that reflect my character and my heart and my personality as you live in God's world, God's way. When we don't do that, we, of course, tend to abdicate that role. This is not a new question. This is going to be the same invitation that Israel is going to get invited into here throughout the story of Exodus and throughout the Old Testament, to become a people, to become a community where God will reign as king. And then the language of the Old Testament is that you will be a light to the nations, that there's this blessing that needs to move through you in a way that impacts others. And friends, I just want to say this is our story too. Jesus sends equally mixed messages. The Great Commission is one of these really well-known passages. It's at the end of Matthew's biography, chapter 28. And Jesus starts this, if you remember these famous words. He says, all power in heaven and earth has been given to me. And you can picture his followers going, you go, Jesus. I can hardly wait to hear what you are about to do. And then he turns around and says, so now go. Make disciples of all people. Wait a minute, you just said all. Oh, for goodness sakes, he's doing it again. This is God delights to do exactly this, to work in the world through people. The question you and I would ask is why? Certainly this is not the quickest way to accomplish things. It is not the most efficient way. You and I know the kind of mess that we leave in the wake of our everyday lives. I heard a pastor answer this question the following way, and I'll share it with you because it resonated with me. But he said this, he goes, as parents, if you want to get a task done and you want to do it efficiently and properly, you do not bring your kids in to help you. And it could be as simple as mowing the lawn or baking a batch of cookies. But if you want to do it quickly and you want to do it right, you don't involve your children. The edges won't be right. The lines will be off. It'll be way messier. You'll have more dishes afterwards. Like, we just know this, right? He goes, but if the point isn't so much the task, the point is the relationship. In fact, the relationship might be more important than the task. He goes, then you bring your kids along because it's precisely in the interaction of these things that we get to know each other. And it's in the interaction that our kids start to learn about our heart and what we love and what we want to see done here because we coach. And they do it wrong, but we love them and we correct them. And this is, our God is inherently relational. And I think God could do a lot of things much more efficiently and effectively without using human creation, but its efficiency is not his primary goal. It's an opportunity for us to be invited into God's story. And while that doesn't leave you a specific application, reflect on that as you head into the different facets and places and chapters of your week with your family and at your work and in your school and in your neighborhood. You and I continue to be invited to live as God's representatives in this world. And if we were layering this a little bit with some of what we were talking about last week, we said God's story is often carried out in powerfully unexpected ways and with unexpected people, like in ways we wouldn't expect. You and I may not be called or tasked to walk or step into a role like Moses was. We said if these are God's plans and purposes in the world, there are no unimportant parts in this story. And that includes you and that includes me. Let me leave you one last thought here, and I'll use this as a bridge to communion this morning. Our passage began with Moses seeing. It says Moses saw one day an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And throughout our text, we find God looking upon or seeing the oppression of his people. In Hebrew, this is not about eye contact. It's not that Moses opened the shutters one day and went, wow, I've never seen that before. I should do something about that. It's about seeing something with the heart, identifying deeply with something that moves us to respond as a result. Moses saw something and it moved him to respond. God finally comes onto the scene and announces, I'm I identify with my people, and it's moving me to respond. What I want to say, friends, is as we participate in communion together, this is the story of a God who sees us. Of a God who sees the broken, sin-sick, lost nature of his estranged, image-bearing creation, but who sees them in a way that he is moved to respond on their behalf. And that's our story of a God who left heaven to identify with his people, to live among them, to teach, to say, hey, get it right. This is how this works. This is how this should look. But who also identified with us to the point of suffering and dying in our stead. As we track through Exodus, the Israelites have a commemorative meal that they always go back to. It's Passover. This is the meal that shapes them as a people, that they never forget. This is who we were, and this is who we are because of what God did for us. This is our meal, friends. This is the meal that continues to be our story, that we remind each other of, and that continues to shape us. A story that reminds us of the God who sees us, that humbles us, moves us to thankfulness and response. It's also the story that needs to shape us so that we also become God's representatives who see and identify the brokenness around us so that we can live into that story as his image-bearing creation. The symbolism of holding a little prepackaged communion cup is not the same as what we normally get to do, but this is what we are allowed to participate with together. You should have received one of these upon entry. If you haven't, feel free to put your hand up, and an usher will make sure that you are served shortly. So here in the back. Those of you who are tuning in virtually, if you haven't picked up some supplies already or have some readily on hand, feel free to hit the pause button. This is the beauty of live television, and feel free to come join us here in a moment as you're ready. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pray just a blessing on what we sometimes just call these elements here. In the past, we sometimes participate with them separately, but your wafer is included with the juice. And I'm going to pray once, and we'll invite you to spend some time just reflecting quietly on the God who sees you. And as you're ready, feel free simply to participate with both elements at the same time. Our worship team will be up here. We'll be singing a bit. And as you feel free, you can also join with us as we kind of wrap up our time giving thanks to God for what he has done for us. On the night he was betrayed, Jesus took bread and he broke it, gave thanks and said, "This is my body, which is for you." And in the same way, we read after supper, he took the cup. He said, "This is the new covenant in my blood." Not just do this in remembrance of me, but he says, whenever you eat this bread and whenever you drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. You allow this story to continue to be what shapes us. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you so much for your great love for us, that you are the God who sees his people, and the God whose heart is moved to respond as a result. Thank you for your story. It continues to come to us, and it amazes us, it surprises us. In some ways, it feels almost offensive. The God of the universe would take on human flesh. I think I just pray that this story would be something that continues to shape us, that you would let it move in our hearts. Sometimes when we hear things a lot, it stops being as impactful as it should be. And so may this be something that humbles us. May it be something that brings a tremendous sense of joy and purpose to our lives. We are your image-bearing creation, freed from slavery to sin, washed, not in the Red Sea, but we say because of your blood. It invites us to live as the new creation. Until your kingdom comes fully, this is our role and our task in this world. And so thank you for this privilege. We pray all of this with thanksgiving because of your great faithfulness. Amen.